The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the valley, shattering Beatrice Morgan's world like a mirror dropped on hardwood. She knew before the messenger arrived at her homestead what the news would be: Thomas was gone, killed in a standoff with cattle rustlers while defending their neighbor's ranch. Spring of 1878 had arrived in Wyoming Territory with promises of renewal, but for Beatrice, it brought only emptiness. The small ranch house that once vibrated with her husband's hearty laughter now stood silent as a tomb. 26 years old and alone, she found herself struggling against the wilderness that threatened to reclaim all they had built over 5 years of marriage. Mrs. Morgan? The knock at her door came 3 weeks after the funeral. Beatrice wiped flour-covered hands on her apron and tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear before opening the door. Sheriff Mills stood awkwardly on her porch, hat in hand. "Madam, I wanted to check how you're faring. Getting on all right?" Beatrice offered a thin smile. "As well as can be expected, Sheriff. The thing is, Mrs. Morgan," he continued, eyes fixed on his hat brim, "that mortgage payment's coming due next month. Bank's been asking." The reality she'd been avoiding crashed down upon her shoulders. Thomas had taken out a loan to expand their cattle operation just before his death. The payment would be impossible to meet alone. "I understand," she said, though understanding did nothing to fill her empty pantry or mend the fence line damaged in the last storm. "Have you considered selling? Young widow like yourself might do better back east with family." Beatrice straightened her spine. "This land was Thomas's dream, Sheriff. And mine too. I'm not leaving." The words sounded braver than she felt. The truth was, she had no family back east to return to. Her parents had passed years ago, and she'd followed Thomas west with nothing but love and determination. Now she had only the latter. "Well, if you change your mind." Sheriff Mills replaced his hat. "Just don't wait too long. Winter in these parts doesn't care much for pride." After he left, Beatrice sank into Thomas's chair by the cold hearth. The ranch needed more than one pair of hands. That was the simple truth of Western life. She needed help, but hiring required money she didn't have. Morning brought no solutions, but it did bring unwelcome visitors. Beatrice was collecting eggs when 3 riders approached from the east. She recognized Franklin Holcomb, the banker, flanked by 2 men she didn't know. "Mrs. Morgan," Holcomb called from horseback, not bothering to dismount. "I've come to discuss your situation." "My situation is my own concern, Mr. Holcomb." The banker's thin lips twisted into something resembling a smile. "Not when you owe the bank $200, it isn't. I've brought a potential buyer for your property." The taller of his companions tipped his hat. "Madam, Walter Preston. I own the big peas spread north of here. I'd be willing to take this place off your hands for a fair price." "This land isn't for sale." Preston exchanged glances with Holcomb. "Mrs. Morgan, with respect, a woman alone can't manage a ranch this size. You'd be doing yourself a favor." "Mr. Preston," Beatrice replied, clutching her basket of eggs tighter. "With respect, I'll decide what favors I need. Good day, gentlemen." After they departed, Beatrice leaned against the henhouse wall, trembling. Preston's offer would barely cover her debt, leaving her with nothing. She knew his reputation. He'd been trying to absorb smaller ranches for years, creating an empire at the expense of families like hers. That evening, she calculated what remained of their savings. If she sold half their cattle now, she might make the payment, but that would leave her with too small a herd to sustain the ranch through winter. She needed a miracle, or at the very least, affordable help. The answer came the following day, unexpected as a summer blizzard. Beatrice was struggling to repair the buckboard wagon when hoofbeats approached from the western trail. She reached for the rifle leaning against the barn door as a precaution. A lone rider emerged from the tree line, tall in the saddle with shoulders broad enough to block the afternoon sun. He pulled his horse to a stop at a respectful distance. "Madam," he called, raising empty hands to show he meant no harm. "Name's Hayes Cooper. I'm looking for work." Beatrice kept the rifle ready but lowered it slightly. "Mr. Cooper, your timing is peculiar. What brings you to this particular ranch?" The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. Now that he stood before her, Beatrice noted the weathered quality of his face, not old, perhaps 30 or so, but marked by sun and experience. His eyes, startlingly blue against tanned skin, held her gaze steadily. Truth be told, I heard in town about Thomas Morgan's widow trying to hold on to her place. Thought you might need a hand. He paused, glancing at the half-repaired wagon wheel. Looks like I'm right. I can't afford to hire help, Mr. Cooper. I'm not asking for much. Roof over my head, meals, and whatever you can spare when cattle sell in autumn. Suspicion narrowed her eyes. Most men want regular pay. Most men haven't been where I've been. Something in his voice hinted at stories he wasn't ready to tell. I need a fresh start more than I need money right now. Beatrice studied him. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner direct without being threatening. Most importantly, the cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, and her strength alone wasn't enough. There's a small cabin behind the barn, she said finally. Previous owner used it for hands. It needs work, but it's yours if you want it. Relief softened his features. Thank you, Mrs. Morgan. You won't regret it. I hope not, Mr. Cooper. Work starts at dawn. True to his word, Hayes was in the corral breaking the day's first light, mending the gate that had been broken for weeks. Beatrice watched from the kitchen window as she prepared breakfast, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake letting a stranger into her life. By midday, her doubts began to fade. Hayes worked methodically and thoroughly, moving from one task to the next without direction. He spoke little but answered her questions directly. When asked about his past, he mentioned only that he'd ranched in Colorado, fought briefly in the war, and had been drifting since. Lost my taste for permanence, he explained as they ate a simple lunch of cornbread and beans. But a man gets tired of moving eventually. And what happens when that tiredness passes, Mr. Cooper? When the urge to wander returns? His eyes met hers across the table. I give my word, Mrs. Morgan. I won't leave you high and dry. Something in the way he said it, the quiet certainty, perhaps made her believe him. Days stretched into weeks, and the ranch began to breathe again under Hayes's attention. Fences were mended, cattle rounded up from distant pastures, and the barn roof patched before summer storms could damage it further. Beatrice found herself working alongside him, rediscovering muscles and skills that marriage had softened but not erased. You handle that axe better than most men I've known, Hayes observed one evening as she split firewood. My father believed daughters should be capable, she replied, swinging again. The log split cleanly. Said a woman never knows when she'll need to fend for herself. Wise man. He would have liked Thomas. The words slipped out before she could catch them, opening the door to grief she'd been keeping closed. She set down the axe, suddenly unable to continue. Hayes didn't offer empty comfort or change the subject. He simply waited, giving her pain the respect of acknowledgement. We were married 5 years, Beatrice said finally. Not nearly long enough. No, Hayes agreed softly. It wouldn't have been, even if you'd had 50. The simple understanding in his voice broke something loose inside her. For the first time since the funeral, Beatrice allowed herself to cry freely, turning away so he wouldn't see. She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder, not presuming, just present. I should finish this, she said when she could speak again, reaching for the axe. Hayes didn't remove his hand. Let me help, Beatrice. Not because you can't do it, but because you don't have to do it alone. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and somehow it didn't feel improper. She nodded, relinquishing the axe, allowing herself the unfamiliar comfort of shared burden. June brought the first mortgage payment due. Beatrice rode into town alone, the money secured in her saddlebag proceeds from the sale of their finest bull and 2 prized horses. The sacrifice stung, but it would buy them time. Franklin Holcomb didn't bother concealing his surprise when she counted out the full amount on his desk. I must say, Mrs. Morgan, I didn't expect this. Clearly, she replied, tucking the receipt carefully into her purse. Will there be anything else, Mr. Holcomb? His thin smile returned. Just wondering how long you can keep this up. One payment doesn't secure your future. My future isn't your concern. As she left the bank, Walter Preston stepped into her path. Mrs. Morgan, my offer still stands. In fact, I'm willing to increase it now that you've demonstrated the property's value. Mr. Preston, this property isn't for sale today, tomorrow, or ever to you. His expression hardened. You're making a mistake. A woman alone, she's not alone. Hayes's voice cut through the conversation as he emerged from the general store across the street. He crossed to stand beside Beatrice, packages tucked under one arm. Mrs. Morgan has all the help she needs. Preston's eyes narrowed as he assessed Hayes. Cooper, isn't it? Heard you drifted in from nowhere. Interesting choice of employee, Mrs. Morgan. Good day, Mr. Preston, Beatrice said firmly, turning away. Hayes walked beside her to where their horses were hitched. Sorry for interrupting. Seemed like he needed reminding of certain facts. Thank you, she said, surprised by how much she meant it. Though I'm perfectly capable of handling Walter Preston. Never doubted it, Hayes replied with the ghost of a smile. But sometimes it's satisfying to watch someone else put a snake in his place. The ride home was companionable, the summer air sweet with wildflowers and promise. Beatrice found herself studying Hayes's profile against the setting sun, wondering about the shadows that occasionally darkened his eyes. He remained a mystery in many ways, despite their daily proximity. Why did you really come to my ranch, Hayes? She asked as they crested the final hill overlooking the homestead. He considered the question, taking his time as he always did with important matters. Sometimes a man recognizes a kindred spirit, he said finally. Someone who's fighting the same battle against loss. I saw how everyone in town talked about poor Mrs. Morgan while circling like vultures, waiting for you to fail. And you decided to intervene? I decided to offer what I had: 2 hands and a strong back. The choice to accept was yours. It was the right answer, acknowledging her agency rather than painting himself as her savior. Beatrice realized with startling clarity that she'd begun to trust this quiet man with the troubled eyes and steady hands. July brought scorching heat and the back-breaking work of haying. Hayes taught Beatrice to use the new mechanical mower he'd repaired from parts they found in the barn's loft. Together, they worked from dawn until dusk, cutting, raking, and stacking winter feed for the cattle. One evening, exhausted beyond measure, Beatrice stumbled and would have fallen if Hayes hadn't caught her arm. That's enough for today, he said firmly. You're working yourself to collapse. There's more to do, she protested weakly. And tomorrow to do it in. His hand remained on her arm, warm and steadying. Thomas wouldn't want you killing yourself over this place, Beatrice. The mention of her husband's name no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. Instead, a bittersweet ache filled her chest. No, he wouldn't. He always said I was stubborn as a mule. Smart man, Hayes murmured, and the corners of his eyes crinkled with the smile he rarely showed. Back at the house, Hayes insisted on preparing the evening meal while Beatrice soaked her aching feet in a basin of cool water. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly, how seamlessly they'd developed rhythms and routines, how comfortable his presence had become in a house that had felt so empty. You're a fair cook, Mr. Cooper, she observed as they ate the simple but satisfying stew he'd prepared. Necessary skill for a man on his own, he replied. Though I'll never match your biscuits. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Beatrice found herself watching his hands as he ate, strong, capable hands that had brought her ranch back from the brink of failure. Hands that had never overstepped their bounds, though they'd had countless opportunities. Tell me about Colorado, she said suddenly. What made you leave? Hayes set down his spoon, and that familiar shadow crossed his face. It's not a pleasant story. Few true stories are, in my experience. He nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. I had a small spread near Pueblo. Wife named Sarah, baby on the way. He paused, and Beatrice's heart constricted, already anticipating the turn his tale would take. Influenza took them both in '75. 1 week they were there, next they were gone. Hayes, I'm so sorry. Sold everything after that. Couldn't bear to stay where every corner held a memory. His voice remained steady, but his eyes betrayed the depth of wound that hadn't fully healed. Spent 3 years drifting, taking work where I could find it. Nothing permanent. Until now, Beatrice said softly. Their eyes met across the table, a current of understanding passing between them. 2 people who knew the particular agony of having dreams shattered, futures erased. Until now, Hayes agreed. August brought the threat of prairie fire. Lightning struck a stand of dry pines on the western border of the ranch, and within hours, a wall of flame raced toward their land. We need to make a fire break, Hayes shouted over the distant roar. Plow a wide strip along the creek bed. Beatrice harnessed the team while Hayes readied the plow. Together, they worked feverishly, cutting a swath of bare earth to stop the advancing flames. The sky darkened with smoke, and ash rained down around them. Hayes's face was streaked with soot, his shirt soaked with sweat as he guided the plow horses through increasingly panicked paces. "The cattle!" Beatrice cried, suddenly remembering the herd grazing in the western pasture. "I'll get them." Hayes leapt from the plow seat. "Keep widening the break." "Not alone," she protested, but he was already running for his horse. Beatrice continued the desperate work, fear clutching at her throat as Hayes disappeared into the smoke-filled distance. The fire's roar grew louder, and embers began falling around her. One of the plow horses reared in terror, nearly overturning the equipment. An hour passed with no sign of Hayes or the cattle. The fire break was as wide as she could make it, but the inferno approached relentlessly. Beatrice stood at the edge of the cleared ground, straining to see through the smoke-filled air. Then came the sound of bawling cattle and pounding hoofs. Through the haze emerged Hayes, driving the herd before him, his bandana pulled over his face against the smoke. He urged the animals across the firebreak to safety, counting as they passed. "That's all of them," he called hoarsely, dismounting beside Beatrice as the last cow crossed to safety. The fire reached the edge of their break, flames leaping high as if frustrated by the barrier. Sparks flew across, igniting small patches that Hayes and Beatrice frantically stamped out. For hours they battled, until finally the main fire veered southward, following the path of least resistance away from their land. Exhausted, they collapsed on the scorched earth, faces blackened, lungs burning from smoke. "We saved it," Beatrice whispered, scarcely believing their fortune. Hayes nodded, too tired for words. His hand found hers in the ash-covered grass, squeezing once an anchor in the chaos they'd just survived. They stayed that way until breathing became easier, connected by clasped hands and shared victory. When Hayes finally spoke, his voice was rough from smoke and emotion. "Haven't fought for something like that in a long time," he said. "Feels different than just surviving." Beatrice understood completely. For the first time since Thomas's death, she'd fought for her future rather than just enduring her present. And she hadn't fought alone. Back at the house, they took turns washing away soot and ash. Hayes's shirt was singed beyond repair, revealing angry red burns across his shoulders where embers had fallen. Beatrice insisted on treating them, applying salve with gentle fingers. "You could have been killed," she said softly as she worked. Hayes remained still under her ministrations. "Some things are worth the risk." "Cattle? No." He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting firelight from the hearth. "A home. Someone's dream." The simple truth of his words struck her deeply. This man understood what the ranch represented, not just land and livestock, but Thomas's vision, her future, their shared labor. "Thank you," she whispered, suddenly aware of how close they stood, of her hands still resting lightly on his bare shoulders. Hayes covered one of her hands with his own, holding it in place against his skin. "Beatrice," he said, her name like a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. She should step away. Propriety, memory, loyalty all demanded distance. Yet she remained, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "It's too soon," she said, though whether she was telling him or herself, she couldn't say. Hayes nodded, releasing her hand. "I know," he said simply, and somehow she understood he meant more than just her grief for Thomas. He too carried ghosts between them. September brought the cattle drive to the railhead in Cheyenne. Normally, this would require hiring additional hands, but the neighboring Rollins family, grateful for Hayes's help during the fire which had threatened their land as well, offered to combine herds and share the work. Beatrice insisted on riding along, despite Hayes's concerns. "I went with Thomas every year," she explained as they prepared for departure. "I know the trail. It's not your capability I question," Hayes replied as he adjusted her saddle. "It's whether you need to prove it at the cost of exhaustion." She smiled at his transparent concern. "I'll rest when the mortgage is paid, Mr. Cooper." The cattle drive took 8 days of hard riding, dust, and minimal sleep. Beatrice proved her worth many times over, holding her position during a near stampede and helping deliver a calf that couldn't wait for the journey's end. Hayes watched her with growing admiration, never interfering but always nearby if needed. At the rail yard, cattle buyers circled like hawks, offering prices far below market value when they saw a woman among the ranchers. $40 a head is robbery, Beatrice told the Chicago buyer who'd approached their herd. These are prime stock. Madam, that's my final offer. Take it or drive them back home. Hayes stepped forward, but Beatrice raised a hand to stop him. This was her battle. Mr. Pennington, she addressed the buyer. These cattle will grade out higher than any you've seen this season. You know it. I know it. And so does the buyer from Kansas City who just offered me 45. But I thought to give you first opportunity, given our history with your company. It was a bluff. She'd spoken to no other buyer, but the mention of competition worked its magic. After tough negotiation, they settled on $50 per head, a price that would not only meet the next mortgage payment, but leave funds for winter supplies and seed for spring planting. That night, their business concluded. Hayes suggested they stay in town rather than immediately starting the return journey. You've earned a proper meal and a real bed, he insisted. The trail can wait one more day. Beatrice hesitated, conscious of appearances, but the prospect of hot food and clean sheets proved too tempting to resist. They found rooms at a respectable hotel and agreed to meet for dinner in the hotel restaurant. Beatrice used some of her earnings to purchase a new dress, the first since Thomas's death. The deep green fabric complemented her auburn hair, which she wore down rather than in her practical work braid. When she entered the restaurant, Hayes stood from their table, his expression making her glad she'd made the effort. You look beautiful, he said simply. Over dinner, they talked of plans for the ranch improvements now possible with the successful sale. Beatrice found herself including Hayes in these future visions without question, as if his presence had become a permanent fixture in her mind. I've been thinking about expanding the vegetable garden, she said. Perhaps adding an orchard on that south slope. Trees take years to bear fruit, Hayes observed. Yes, she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. They do. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of longer horizons, of futures intertwined beyond immediate necessity. After dinner, Hayes walked her to her room door. Thank you, Beatrice said, for suggesting we stay. I'd forgotten how pleasant civilization can be. You've worked harder than anyone I've known, he replied. You deserve moments of ease. They stood in the quiet hallway, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Hayes reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Good night, Beatrice, he said softly. Good night, Hayes. She entered her room and leaned against the closed door, heart racing with emotions she'd thought buried with Thomas. Guilt mingled with longing, loyalty with new possibility. She'd loved her husband completely. How could there be room for these feelings toward Hayes? Yet denying them seemed increasingly impossible. Over months of shared work and danger, Hayes Cooper had become essential to her world in ways that transcended mere practical assistance. The ride home allowed for little private conversation, but Beatrice caught Hayes watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. His eyes held questions he wouldn't ask, patience she hadn't requested but desperately needed. October painted the aspen groves gold and crimson as the land prepared for winter's sleep. With the cattle sold and the mortgage secured for another 6 months, work on the ranch shifted to winterizing, stacking firewood, repairing the root cellar, ensuring the barn was draft-free for the remaining livestock. On a crisp morning, Beatrice found Hayes replacing boards on the cabin he'd occupied since spring. The small structure had transformed under his care from a neglected outbuilding to a proper dwelling, with curtains at the windows and a stone path leading to the door. Making improvements? She asked, offering the coffee she'd brought. Thought I'd fix that north wall before snow flies, he replied, accepting the cup gratefully. Gets bitter in here when the wind comes down from the mountains. Beatrice hesitated, then spoke the words she'd been considering for days. The house has an extra bedroom. It would be warmer for winter. Hayes set down his hammer, studying her face carefully. That's a generous offer, but people would talk. People already talk. A widow with a male employee living on her property. She smiled wryly. According to Mrs. Talbot at the general store, we've been the subject of speculation since July. All the more reason to maintain proper appearances, Hayes said, though something in his eyes suggested he was arguing against his own desires. Hayes, Beatrice said softly, I'm not offering impropriety, just practicality. There's no sense in you freezing when there's space going unused. He considered this, then nodded slowly. Until spring, then, when the weather turns. That evening, Hayes moved his few belongings into the spare room. The house felt different with his permanent presence fuller, somehow, as if empty spaces were gradually being reclaimed from grief. They developed new routines. Hayes would rise first, lighting the stove and starting coffee before heading out for morning chores. Beatrice would prepare breakfast, which they shared before dividing the day's work. Evenings were spent by the fire, sometimes in companionable silence, sometimes sharing stories of their lives before loss had reshaped them. Beatrice learned that Hayes had been a schoolteacher before the war, that he played the harmonica, though poorly by his own admission, that his father had taught him to track game when he was just 7 years old. In turn, she shared her childhood in Pennsylvania, her love of literature, her secret dream of someday seeing the ocean. One night, as the first snow fell outside, Hayes asked about Thomas. "Tell me about him," he said quietly. "If you'd like to." Beatrice stared into the fire, considering. She'd avoided speaking of Thomas at length, fearing both the pain of remembrance and the possibility that sharing him might somehow diminish what they'd had. He laughed easily, she began finally. "Found humor in the smallest things. When we first came west, everything went wrong. Wagon axle broke. Rain soaked our supplies. We got hopelessly lost. But Thomas would just shake his head and say, 'Well, that's a story to tell our grandchildren someday.'" Hayes listened attentively as she continued, describing Thomas's determination, his kindness to strangers, his dream of building something lasting in this wild country. "He sounds like a good man," Hayes said when she finished. "The kind worth remembering." "He was," Beatrice agreed, surprised to find the memories brought more comfort than pain. "Thank you for asking about him. Most people avoid his name, as if speaking it might shatter me." "Grief isn't something to hide from," Hayes said. "It's the price we pay for having loved well." The simple wisdom of his words settled around her like a blanket. For the first time, Beatrice considered that perhaps moving forward didn't require forgetting that Thomas could remain part of her heart even as new feelings took root. Winter descended in earnest, transforming the landscape into a vast white stillness. Days shortened, and they spent more time indoors. Hayes carved chess pieces from scraps of wood, teaching Beatrice the game during long evenings. She discovered a competitive streak that delighted him, especially when she began winning as often as she lost. "You're a natural strategist," he commented after a particularly hard-fought match. "Or perhaps a good student with an excellent teacher," she countered, enjoying the warmth in his eyes when she complimented him. Christmas approached, bringing memories of holidays past. Beatrice found herself thinking of Thomas less frequently, and when she did, the sharp edge of grief had softened. She wondered if he would approve of the changes in her life, of Hayes's steady presence. One evening, returning from checking the livestock, Hayes stamped snow from his boots and entered the kitchen to find Beatrice hanging evergreen boughs along the mantel. "Thought we might acknowledge the season," she explained, almost apologetically. Thomas always insisted on decorations. Hayes crossed to help her reach the highest spot. "Sarah loved Christmas too," he said, his hand brushing hers as they positioned the greenery. "Made paper snowflakes for every window, no matter how small our cabin was." The casual mention of his late wife, something that had been rare until now, struck Beatrice as significant. They were both beginning to speak of their lost loves more easily, their ghosts becoming benevolent presences rather than barriers. On Christmas Eve, Hayes disappeared after breakfast, returning hours later with a small pine tree strapped to his saddle. "Thought you might like this," he said as he set it up in the corner of the sitting room. Beatrice found the box of ornaments she hadn't been able to face the previous Christmas. Together, they decorated the little tree, sharing stories behind special pieces. When they finished, Hayes produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It isn't much," he said, suddenly seeming uncertain, "but I wanted you to have something." Inside the package, Beatrice found a delicately carved wooden box. The lid featured an intricate rendering of their ranch house, surrounded by aspen trees and distant mountains. "Hayes," she breathed, tracing the carving with her fingertips. "It's beautiful." "Open it," he encouraged softly. Inside lay a silver locket on a fine chain. When she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal an empty space waiting to be filled. "For memories," Hayes explained. "Past and future." Tears filled her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. Without hesitation, she asked him to help her fasten it around her neck, turning so he could secure the clasp. His fingers were gentle against her skin, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. "I have something for you too," she said, retrieving a package from her sewing basket. It contained a leather-bound journal she'd ordered from the catalog months ago, intending it for Thomas before his death. "You mentioned once that you used to write," she explained as Hayes ran his hand over the smooth cover. "Thought you might take it up again." "Thank you," he said, voice rough with emotion. "For remembering." Their eyes met in the glow of firelight and candles, the decorated tree casting fragrant shadows across the room. Beatrice felt the world narrow to this moment. This man whose patience and strength had rebuilt not just her ranch, but pieces of herself she'd thought forever broken. Hayes stepped closer, his hand reaching tentatively to touch her cheek. "Beatrice," he whispered, her name a question and a promise all at once. She closed the distance between them, letting her heart lead for the first time since Thomas's death. Hayes's lips met hers with gentle reverence, a kiss that acknowledged their shared pasts while opening the door to something new. When they parted, Hayes rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since August," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" "Some things can't be rushed," he replied simply, "especially when they matter this much." The winter deepened, bringing blizzards that confined them to the house for days at a time. Their relationship evolved with cautious joy, each discovering the comfort of loving again after believing such possibility lost forever. Yet challenges remained. In February, Walter Preston rode through a snowstorm to deliver news that Franklin Holcomb had sold Beatrice's mortgage to him. "Thought you should hear it from me directly," Preston said, brushing snow from his coat as he stood in their kitchen. His eyes noted Hayes's presence with calculated interest. "Nothing changes regarding your payments, of course, but I now hold the note on this property." "Why would you do that?" Beatrice demanded. Preston smiled thinly. "Investment, Mrs. Morgan. Pure and simple. I believe in this land's potential." After he departed, Hayes voiced what they both suspected. "He's hoping you'll default. One missed payment, and he could foreclose." "Then we won't miss a payment," Beatrice said with determination. "We'll work harder, sell more cattle in spring, whatever it takes." Hayes took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "We will," he agreed, the pronoun cementing their partnership in ways beyond romantic attachment. As winter reluctantly yielded to spring, the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Calving season brought new life and promise of future prosperity. Hayes expanded the vegetable garden as Beatrice had suggested, planting the beginnings of an apple orchard on the south slope. In April, Sheriff Mills rode out with news that surprised them both. "Seems Preston's been buying up mortgages all over the county," he explained over coffee at their kitchen table. "Railroad's coming through next year, and he's positioned himself to control most of the land along the proposed route." "The railroad?" Beatrice echoed. "Through this valley? Would increase the value of this place tenfold," Hayes noted, understanding dawning. "That's why he's been so persistent." The sheriff nodded. "Preston's not one to let personal animosity interfere with profit. He wants your land, Mrs. Morgan, and he's never been particular about how he gets what he wants." After the sheriff departed, Beatrice and Hayes sat in thoughtful silence. "We could sell," Hayes suggested carefully. "With the railroad coming, you'd get far more than you ever expected for this place. Enough to start fresh somewhere else, without Preston's shadow." Beatrice studied his face, seeing no self-interest in his suggestion, only concern for her welfare. "Is that what you want? To leave?" "What I want," Hayes said deliberately, "is whatever brings you peace. This land was your dream with Thomas. I won't presume to replace that." His consideration touched her deeply. "This land was our beginning," she acknowledged, "but perhaps not our only possible future." That night, lying beside Hayes in what had once been her marriage bed, Beatrice considered how life's unexpected turns had brought her to this moment. Thomas would always be her first love, the man who had shown her the beauty of this wild country. But Hayes had helped her discover strength she hadn't known she possessed, and the capacity of her heart to expand rather than simply heal. "I want to stay and fight," she whispered into the darkness. "This is our home now, yours and mine." Hayes pulled her closer, his voice steady with promise. "Then we'll face Preston together." May brought unexpected allies. Word of Preston's railroad speculation had spread, angering smaller ranchers throughout the valley who now faced similar pressure tactics. When Beatrice and Hayes rode into town for supplies, they found themselves approached by a group led by Samuel Rollins. "We're forming an association," Rollins explained. "Small ranchers banding together against Preston's monopoly. Strength in numbers." The Cattlemen's Protective Association, as they called themselves, pooled resources to hire a lawyer from Cheyenne who specialized in land disputes. He discovered irregularities in Preston's acquisition of several mortgages, including possible fraud in his dealings with the bank. "It won't be enough to stop him completely," the lawyer cautioned during a meeting at the Rollins ranch. "But it might buy us time to secure your positions." For Beatrice and Hayes, that meant working even harder to ensure their next payment would be made early, leaving Preston no legal opening to seize their property. They rose before dawn and worked until nightfall, united in purpose. In June, exactly 1 year after Hayes had ridden onto her land seeking work, Beatrice woke to find him gone from their bed. Concerned, she dressed quickly and went searching, eventually finding him at Thomas's grave on the hill overlooking the ranch. Hayes heard her approach, but didn't turn immediately. "I needed to speak with him," he said quietly. Man to man. Beatrice's throat tightened with emotion. She'd visited this spot regularly during her first months of widowhood, but less frequently as time passed and life demanded her attention. "What did you tell him?" she asked, slipping her hand into Hayes's. "That I love his wife," Hayes replied simply. "That I'll protect what you built together. That I'm grateful he loved you first, because loving you has saved me." Tears filled her eyes at the simple, profound declaration. Hayes turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Beatrice Morgan, when I rode onto your land a year ago, I was a half-alive man just drifting through existence. You gave me purpose again, a home, hope." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "I'm asking if you'll make it permanent, if you'll be my wife." Beatrice looked from the ring to Hayes's earnest face, then to the distant view of the ranch spread below them, the land she'd fought so hard to keep, now flourishing under their shared care. "You once told me that grief is the price we pay for having loved well," she said softly. "I think perhaps new love is the reward for having grieved honestly." She extended her hand, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger. "Yes, Hayes Cooper, I will be your wife." He gathered her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't capture. When they parted, Beatrice rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had become the rhythm of her days. "I think Thomas would approve," she whispered. "I hope so," Hayes replied. "A good man deserves to be remembered well." They walked hand in hand back to the house that had witnessed both her deepest sorrow and this unexpected joy. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the yard, two figures moving forward together into whatever the future might hold. In July, with wildflowers painting the hills in purple and gold, Beatrice Morgan became Beatrice Cooper in a simple ceremony attended by their neighbors and friends. Sheriff Mills officiated, his usual gruffness softened by the obvious happiness of the couple before him. "Never thought I'd see the day," he confessed during the celebration afterward. "When Thomas passed, I feared for your future, Beatrice. Glad to be proven wrong." Preston attended neither the wedding nor the gathering that followed, but sent a messenger with an envelope containing their mortgage note, marked "paid in full." His way of admitting defeat gracefully, Hayes suggested as they examined the unexpected gift. "Or perhaps ensuring we remember him on our happiest day." "Either way," Beatrice replied, "it means our home is truly ours now." That night, alone in the house that had seen so much change, Hayes took Beatrice in his arms. "When I first saw you struggling with that wagon wheel, your hair falling loose, determination in every line of your body, I thought you were the strongest person I'd ever met." "I wasn't strong," she countered. "I was desperate." "Strength often looks like desperation from the inside," he said wisely. "But I saw a woman refusing to be defeated by circumstances that would have broken most people." Beatrice traced the lines of his face, still marveling that this man had come into her life when she least expected but most needed someone to share her burdens. "You filled the emptiness," she whispered. "Not by replacing what was lost, but by helping me build something new." Hayes kissed her with tender passion. And you gave me back my future, he replied, when I thought mine had ended with Sarah. Autumn brought the ripening of the first apples in their young orchard and news that the railroad survey had been completed, confirming that tracks would indeed pass near their property. The value of their land increased overnight, but neither Beatrice nor Hayes considered selling. This is our legacy now, Hayes said as they stood on the porch watching sunset paint the distant mountains. Something to pass on. His hand rested gently on Beatrice's rounded belly, where their child grew a new life that represented not just their love for each other, but the resilience of hearts that refused to be defined by loss. Winter returned, but this time the house was filled with preparations for the baby due in early spring. Hayes carved a cradle from oak, while Beatrice sewed tiny garments, each stitch an act of hope. The home that had once echoed with emptiness now hummed with anticipation. On a night when snow fell so thickly it obscured the barn from view, Beatrice's labor began. Hayes rode through the blizzard to fetch the midwife, returning with Mrs. Rollins, who had delivered half the children in the county. After hours of effort, as dawn broke over fresh snow, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to announce her determination to embrace life fully. "She has your eyes," Beatrice whispered exhaustedly as Hayes held their daughter for the first time, his large hands cradling her tiny form with infinite gentleness. "And your spirit," he replied, voice thick with emotion. "What shall we call her?" Beatrice had been considering names for months, wanting something that would honor the past while celebrating their future. "Sarah Thomas Cooper," she suggested. "For those who came before, who made our love possible." Hayes nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He placed their daughter in Beatrice's arms and sat beside them on the bed, forming a circle of family where once there had been only solitary grief. As spring renewed the land, bringing fresh green to pastures and buds to the apple trees, the Cooper Ranch thrived. Hayes expanded their cattle operation, while Beatrice, once baby Sarah was old enough, began breeding the horses Thomas had always admired but never had time to raise properly. Their reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout the territory. When the railroad finally arrived the following year, they were well positioned to benefit from the increased access to markets without sacrificing the independence they both cherished. 5 years after Hayes Cooper first rode onto a grieving widow's failing ranch, he and Beatrice stood on their porch watching their daughter chase fireflies in the summer twilight. Sarah, now 4, had her father's thoughtful nature and her mother's determination, a living testament to love's ability to transform loss into new beginning. "Do you ever wonder," Beatrice asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength, "what would have happened if you hadn't come here that day?" Hayes considered the question with his characteristic thoroughness. "I believe some journeys are meant to be taken," he said finally. "Some hearts meant to find each other, even through grief." He turned to face her, the love in his eyes as steady and true as it had been since the day he'd proposed beside Thomas's grave. "Your arms were empty," he said softly. "Mine too. Together, we found a way to fill them again." Beatrice smiled, remembering the words Hayes had spoken the day he'd helped her stack firewood, when she'd been too proud to accept assistance. "Let me help. Not because you can't do it, but because you don't have to do it alone." Simple words that had opened the door to healing, to partnership, to love after loss. Words that had filled empty arms with purpose, then passion, and finally the precious weight of their child. "I love you, Hayes Cooper," she said, rising on tiptoe to kiss him as Sarah's laughter echoed across the yard. "For every day we've had, and all those yet to come." As twilight deepened into night, they called their daughter inside, the three of them moving toward the warmth and light of the home they'd built together, not just the physical structure, but the family they'd created from the ashes of separate sorrows. The ranch that had once represented Beatrice's determined struggle to hold on to the past had transformed into the foundation for a future neither she nor Hayes could have imagined in their darkest days of grief. They had learned the most profound lesson life offers, that hearts, like empty arms, need not remain so forever.